Welcome to CSBA's webinar, Examining AB 86, the School Reopening Bill, where we attempt to separate fact from fiction and get to the bottom of what this new piece of legislation means for public schools and the impact it will have on getting students back into the classroom. We understand this is a hectic time for everyone invested and involved in public education, and we appreciate you joining us. We trust you will find it valuable. We have a great cast with us today to analyze the issue, and before we get to introducing them, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details that will help you participate in this webinar. We would like you to participate in the question and answer session. You can do that by using the module, which for most of you should appear in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you look at this app, there are several gray menu bars. About halfway down, one of them is labeled questions. The arrow is pointing to the right there before the word questions. If you click on that arrow so it's facing downward, this will cause a chat box to open into which you can type your question just as you would for a text message or an email, and then hit send. CSBA staff will get your questions behind the scenes and we'll try to address it if we can. We have a lot of attendees today, so we won't be able to answer every individual question, but we're going to try and isolate those questions which deal with topics that have been raised by the greatest number of people. And if we don't get to it in today's event, please feel free to email us at csba.csba.org with your question, and we will answer it after the fact. But with no further ado, let's meet some of our experts here today who will be breaking down this very important issue. We are lucky to have with us CSBA's CEO and Executive Director, Vernon M. Billy. Also, CSBA's Assistant Executive Director for Governmental Relations, Dennis Meyer, is here. We will be relying on the legal expertise of CSBA General Counsel and Chief of Staff, Keith Bray, and our guests from the local school districts who we're really looking forward to hear from because they can give you first-hand testimony about their experience over the past 12 months and what they're doing to continue with in-person instruction or to increase the amount of in-person instruction available to their students. And the first person from a local district we have is Board President Lori Fong from Santa Rosa City Schools. All three of the trustees that we're fortunate to have with us today are board presidents. The next board president is Linda Lund from Murrieta Valley USD. And we also have board president Kathy Thompson from Central ESD. On the superintendent side of the equation, we have Dr. Sam Buenrostro from Corona Norco USD and Superintendent Jeff Harris from Del Norte USD. It's an august cast, and we are fortunate to have this crew of experts with us. But before we get into the heart of the bill, we'd like to hear a few words from our CEO, Vernon Billy. And Vernon will also be breaking down some of the major components of the bill that CSBA wants to highlight and we'll be addressing as we move forward in the next days, weeks, and months. So I will turn it over to Vernon.
Thank you, Troy, for that introduction. And I want to take a moment to thank all of you for joining us today. Appreciate everyone being here. This is an important topic and discussion, I think, at a time when all of you have been doing the work. You've been doing all the hard work over the last 12 months during this pandemic. Schools have been open in some form or another, whether it's been in person or a hybrid or in Zoom. Districts and county offices have been serving as child care centers. You've helped establish and put in place mobile hotspots for your students. You've helped with food distribution. You have done an incredible job over these last 12 months during this pandemic. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that work that board members and superintendents and district staff have done as we start to talk about AB 86 and the school reopening bill. So with that, before I turn it over to Dennis Myers, our Assistant Executive Director, and Troy Flint, I want to just give you a high-level overview of AB 86, and then we'll dig into the details. So first of all, I think it's important to understand it's $6.6 billion of Prop 98 General Fund money, and it's broken down into basically two pieces, which we are going to talk more about extensively. There's the $2 billion piece, which is the reopening funds to help you to reopen your schools for in-person instruction. The key thing here is that this is for by April 1st to have in-person instruction. And then there's the $4.6 billion in learning recovery funds, which is a separate proposal that's baked into the AB 86. The first apportionment will go out on May 15th. One half of the total apportionment goes out on May 15th. And then the second half of the apportionment will go out on August 15th of this year. I think one key thing to note here is that all these funds must be expended by August 31st of 2022. So again, it's by August 31st, 2022. And there are elements of the programs that are subject to audit requirements. So this will be really, really important. And so with that, let me turn it over to my colleagues.
So we titled this webinar, AB 86, Separating Fact from Fiction. We chose that theme because there's a lot of mythology, a lot of misimpressions, and a lot of misconceptions about AB 86, what's driving it, and what it's likely to accomplish for schools. One of the big mistaken impressions is that AB 86 is just going to be this panacea, and now that the law has been passed, schools across California will just throw open their doors and welcome hordes of students back into the classroom. And if not for this legislation, kids would still be at home. That's not the case at all. The fact of the matter is that schools across California have been working for a year to prepare for this moment. There are many schools in California, although they may not be the ones that have been getting the attention or the notoriety. There are schools that have been open since early this fall, largely without incident. There are many more schools that were planning to open in the late fall, and just as they were prepared to do so safely, California was hit with a major surge in COVID-19 cases. But now that you're seeing those COVID-19 cases subside in most areas, and you're also seeing educators start to get vaccinated, that has opened the door to many more schools reopening here in the past weeks, and many more schools that have set a reopen date for sometime in March or in early April. So it's important to understand that school districts weren't sitting around waiting. The major hurdle to reopening schools were the external health conditions, the rate of COVID spread in communities, and the lack of access to educator vaccinations. And now that those issues are being addressed, we're seeing more schools open. So it's really not the legislation that we've seen that is driving school reopenings. It's educator vaccination, it's relatively low community spread. And if we had prioritized educator vaccinations to a higher degree earlier in the process, as CSBA and others requested, we'd probably be further along right now. But as it is, now that those hurdles are being cleared, you're seeing schools go back, students go back to school, and the hard work that governance teams, that teachers and community have put into preparing for this moment is really starting to pay off. And now, to examine some of the specifics of the bill and how districts can make even more progress going forward, I would like to turn it over to Dennis Myers, CSBA's Assistant Executive Director for Governmental Relations.
One thing is that this is not a grant program anymore. If you looked at earlier proposals, it was a grant program that LEAs had to apply for. This money goes out the door. It's going to be the first apportionment is May 15th, as Vernon had talked about it. And the allocation is based on each LEA's proportional share of the local control funding formula. So the calculation is already made by the Department of Education, and it's based on how the math works for LCFF. This is before backing out property taxes, so basic aid districts play in this money as well. Things that you really need to know there is this is for reopening. The goal is to offer in-person instruction starting no later than April 1st. So there's a penalty built into here of 1% for each day that in-person instruction is not offered between April 1st and May 15th. So I didn't actually count the days, but I think it's like 45 days. So you could lose up to 45% of those funds if you don't comply with the reopening part of the legislation. And we're going to get into a little bit of those details, but just so you know that there is this penalty. There is a forfeiture, complete forfeiture of the money if there is no offering of in-person instruction by May 15th. So you can see there's the penalty, really try to get the incentive out there for everyone to offer based on color tier, things like that, back to in-person instruction. You know, if these funds are forfeited, you would be able to allow up to 10% to for learning loss, things like that. So you could lose, if you're going to forfeit it, up to 90%, hold back 10%, and then you could use that for learning loss. Where the money would come from if there is a forfeiture or if you do get this penalty is from the next apportionment. So as Vernon said, there's 2 apportionments, one's May 15th, one's August 15th. It'd be in that second apportionment that these funds would be withheld. The eligible uses of the funds, it's pretty broad. It's what you would expect in anything where you're going to offer in-person instruction. So it's, it's testing, it's PPE, it's ventilation, it's safety upgrades. It's even, salaries for classified and certificated staff, just in case you need to pay someone to do more or bring people back or even contract for services. And that's also for mental health services. So it's anything you could really relate to reopening. These are allowable expenditures under the legislation. Let's go ahead to the next slide, please. The way this starts is it starts with like the deep purple counties and moves into the red. So what the way the bill on the reopening basically says is everyone needs to be offering at least the cohort part. So cohorts are in our vocabulary already. So these are the smaller groups of students, and the list that's in the bill are those who are chronically absent. It's your homeless students, it's foster youth, it's ELL, it's students with an IEP. So that's the cohorts. Let's say you're in deep purple, you're not, which is 15 cases or more per 100,000. You can't reopen yet according to the guidance, but the cohorts would be a requirement under the legislation. You can see here how the cohorts would work. On the next slide. This is kind of how it goes from deep purple to red. So deep purple is those counties, and I'm not even sure how many are left in the deep purple, but those are 25 cases or higher. You're in the deep purple, and that's where you would at least be required for this $2 billion program to offer instruction to the cohorts that we just talked about on the other page. Now, for purple counties, and that's 7 or above, up to 25, that's where you would then offer the instruction to the cohorts, but then also grades K through 2. And then you'd be allowed to move up to grade 6 in the purple counties as well. For those counties that are red, and every night I'm listening to the news and you see more and more counties getting into the red, and that's where the case rate is 7 and below for a population of 100. Then it's cohorts, all of grades K through 6. And then when allowed, at least 1 full grade level in the middle and high school level, at least 1. So many of you are already open, so you can see how this money could benefit you. But then if you're rolling this out, moving from deep purple to red, you can see how it expands the grade levels to at least get to at least 1 of the higher grade levels. Just on one of the points here on red is we have it listed here as 7. If you've been, kind of tuned in, the governor was announcing, hey, as we're getting more and more vaccinations out, they're targeting some of the zip codes now where there are some of the lower income disadvantaged neighborhoods once a certain level is reached within those neighborhoods, this red tier is actually going to bump up from 7 cases to 10. And I think this is about to happen. So just be careful there, because you need to be aware that your county may bump into red a lot sooner than you were thinking, maybe by a week or 2 or 3. So just make sure that you're paying attention to that. And when we talk about in-person instruction, you know, in this program, but also in the next program, hybrids are allowed. So it's not like, hey, bring everybody back and you know, you have to cram everybody in the classroom. No, hybrids are allowed. One is because some of you have to use hybrids to keep the social distancing in place, but then also some of you are also going to have some of your parents not wanting to bring their kids back for, you know, as maybe as soon as you open. So that's why in-person includes hybrid. Next slide, please.
So returning to the fact from fiction theme, another misconception is that participants in AB 86 can only offer in-person instruction, and that means the end of other modes of instruction that they've been having up to this point. In fact, that's not true. AB 86 requires that all school districts continue distance learning options for families that prefer it, as well as for students in those grades that aren't returning to in-person instruction immediately. So the key message here is, if you prefer distance learning at this time, you can still do that, even if your school district, your LEA, is taking part in AB 86.
Great. Next slide, please. As you look through the legislation, there is, you know, requirements for testing, but one of the things that we were able to secure in this is a grandfathering in of existing reopening plans. So those of you who are already open, if you were you know, listening to what the governor was saying back in January, one, it was a grant program that y'all had to apply for. That was fixed, and then it applied to everybody who was even open. So this is major shift, is that those of you who already have your plans in place, you've already got the testing cadence in place, those are grandfathered in. And it's grandfathered in anyone who is reopened or even has a plan to reopen, adopted by March 31st. So that is actually a big movement that you could actually, if you know, get your plan in place now as you're meeting with your staff. As long as that's adopted, you've got the testing cadence and it's approved. That, because the problem was that there's, in the deep purple, there was, you know, weekly testing for all students and staff, and then it moved to less and less testing, asymptomatic, symptomatic, and so that is a major development in this. And then after April 1st, obviously, then you have to look at the Department of Public Health guidelines on testing, depending, and it varies depending on the color of your county. On the the rest of the grandfathering, including those of you who have already adopted your school safety plans, but it's just important to note that the school safety plans, that has not changed as far as what is in the plan. So it's kind of a twofold plan. One is looking at the Cal OSHA requirements, and those are basically for protection of employees. And then there's also the CDPH guidance checklist. If you just Google those, they will come up. That's how we get to it. We just Google CDPH, school checklist, and the checklist actually comes up, and you can see point by point the things that are included on that checklist. If for some reason you opt to not even participate in this program, you still have to post these before you offer in-person instruction. So, we're assuming everyone's going to participate. You're all going to get the money. You're all going to find ways to make sure that you're staying in compliance. But if there's someone who says, nope, we're not playing in it, then you still have to adopt and post your plans. Next slide, please. So let's move now to the other program. So that was all about the reopening in-person instruction, and now this is the one moving forward on the learning recovery. So this is the $4.6 billion program. What we wanted to make sure is that you saw, again, is that this is not a grant that you apply for. The money's going to be allocated. And here's kind of how the money works. So it's $1,000 for every, per homeless student in each LEA. And then the state's going to look at $725 for each student in a state special school. So that's, I don't think state special schools are tuning in right now. So once that money is off the top, the remaining funds go out similar to the $2 billion program, and it's based on your proportional share of LCFF. Again, this includes basic aid school districts, so we want to make sure. One of the things that we were not able to secure, and this was a big deal for CSBA, was a minimum amount for small school districts. So we know that in LCFF, there's the necessary small school calculation, but we're pushing for a minimum dollar amount for districts below 2,500 because your economies of scale aren't as great as bigger districts. That wasn't included, so this is just going to be based on everyone's proportional share of the LCFF. Now, in this program, there's 85% requirement and a 15%. So the 85% requirement has to be used for in-person instruction. Again, in-person is under the rules of social distancing, things like that, and can be hybrid. So we want to make sure that you know that. In that 85%, there's a carve out to hire paraprofessionals. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail in just a second, but we want you to know that, all right, because there's two pieces to this. Up to 15% can be used for distance learning, or if you're already in distance learning, to prepare for in-person. So you can use some of the funds to get ready for in-person learning as well. Okay, but the real deal here is that you got to be aware of this 10% requirement. An expenditure plan for this program has to be adopted by June 1st. So as you do the reopening on the first point, and that's like an April 1st kind of a deadline, you really need to work with your staff to get your expenditure plan adopted by June 1st. And that's a pretty detailed plan. It includes actual estimates of actual expenditures, where you're going to use the money, the supports that you're going to be doing, but there's going to be guidance coming out from the Department of Ed pretty quick. There's a requirement for a pretty fast turnaround from the Department of Ed for this portion of the requirements, so that everyone kind of can follow the same plan. Keith Bray here is our Chief of Staff and General Counsel, is going to talk more about this 10% requirement for paraprofessionals. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Dennis. This is in this bill. It's given you all a lot of dollars, a lot of funds to hire paraprofessionals, and if you don't hire paraprofessionals by the end of August 2022, use up your 10%, it will be taken back from you. It's one of the forfeiture clauses in the bills, and we are just wanting to highlight it this morning as a precaution. It is the intent. There's intent language that says, well, really the first paraprofessionals you hire back are the ones that may have been laid off during this period of time, but it really does provide for a lot more hiring to assist with the extended learning, and we'll talk about those opportunities as they come up. But we just have to be careful when you provide services, especially to those with special needs. Those require the consent of the parent, not only to provide, but also then to withdraw. This is one-time money. That's what we're emphasizing. And so there just has to be a level of caution. There is a bill that's been introduced. It's kind of a double whammy. I mean, these things get introduced, you don't know how far they go, but their AB 4038 has been introduced, which would give the same, basically, tenure rights. They would give the same right to a layoff hearing to classified employees as presently in the law for our certificated employees, and complete with the March 15 deadline, the ALJ hearing, and a decision by the board by May 15. So there's just enough here, I think, to really, as we go through the next several months, to be careful in your hiring practices. We know how difficult it is to find paraprofessionals, and in the prior bill, there was a shall for a full-time hiring. Now it's part-time, which means that you have to go out and look for even more in your local community. So if you don't hire, the only action that will be taken is the money will be retrieved. Dennis? And we've got a time check. It's at 10:30, so we need to acknowledge that in our presentation.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Keith. Next slide, please. Now, getting into some of the details of the 4.6, the learning recovery, is that the implementation kind of rolls out through, what kind of services you're going to provide and to whom. So this is a list that's actually in the legislation on the types of students that are meant to be the focus of this program. And you'll see here, I mean, it's this list isn't a surprise, but it is a pretty broad list. English learners, homeless students, foster youth, anyone who's identified by certificated staff as needing extra help, credit deficient students. So you can see it's a long list because this is about learning recovery. And so you can see here that these are students that you've been concerned about for over a year now, about bringing them back with special services, with targeted assistance to learn up to make up for the time that there has been just distance learning and a lot of the things that have not been able to provide when everybody's on the school site. Next slide, please. So now kind of getting into the plan is, here's the list of students. On this next slide, we'll talk about what the plan should look like. Next slide, please. So this here is just kind of describes the plan. So there's the expenditure plan that we talked about that's due by June 1st, right? And so, consistent with that plan, you need to describe kind of the types of services that you're going to be presenting to these students. And it's a tiered framework, based on targeting those services to those list of students who are in need. It's the supports, based on the academic needs, but also on social emotional. So we know that has always been a major concern of yours as well. And then obviously, engaging learning experiences. So this is like one sentence in the bill of these 3 bullets that lead into the other types of services that are eligible for expenditure under this money. So go ahead for the next slide. We'll kind of give you in bulleted point the types of services for these students. So this, we say allowable use of funds, but as you read the bill, this is a requirement here. So these 6 bullets describe the types of services to provide to those targeted types of students. So you can see it's longer day, longer year, it's summer school, it's intercession programs, really bringing the students back in groups to give them more intense instruction to make up for learning loss. But it also includes professional development for your certificated and classified staff, for them to offer these services and probably even identify students who need additional services, probably in social, emotional. The second to the last bullet on community learning hubs, that's bringing students back into, for use of technology, things like that, to where you can bring them in groups where if they don't have these types of services at home, availability to broadband, things like that, you can offer services at the school site as well. But also, supporting credit deficient students. So these are students who are at risk of perhaps not graduating or at risk of not moving to the next grade level. So you can see here, I mean, it is a pretty broad list, but at the same time, fairly specific. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but from our perspective, this is a good list that offers a lot of things that you're already thinking about and you're already providing if you're already back in in-person instruction. And so these are the allowable uses for the funds. Next slide, please. Troy.
First, I want to thank everyone for showing patience while we work through some technical difficulties, particularly with the video feed. The downside of that is now you have to look at our faces for another hour. But as far as AB 86 is concerned, I think Dennis has done a good job saying that this is not a program you apply for. It's an allocation that will be given to LEAs in 2 parts. So we won't belabor that point. We will move on to the next slide.
Good. Thank you. So on this next slide, there are 2 reporting requirements that whether or not you're going to be in this program, this applies to all public schools and private schools. 2 reporting requirements you need to pay attention to. One is when a student or an employee tests positive and it's notifying public health. The second one is reporting twice a month. And so we know this is going to be a burden. And we've obviously been pointing that out to the administration of the legislature, this requirement of who's on campus, what type of learning is going on, the number of employees, number of students on campus. It's this real detailed, and if I can offer something, editorial, kind of nitpicky information that you're going to be required to report to the Department of Public Health twice a month. And again, this applies to public schools and private schools as they're attempting to track if there is an outbreak, kind of who is on campus. Next slide, please. One thing we wanted to point out here is if you kind of go back to January, you remember the governor talking about vaccinations and trying to prioritize education staff. The bill actually includes language to prioritize vaccinations for education staff. Many counties have already done this. Many of you are just now getting to this and rolling this out. The bill also sets aside 10% of vaccination for education workers and childcare. Again, those are things that were put in the statute that the governor was doing through executive authority, and we had actually asked, hey, why not put that into the bill? And so that was done. One thing that's very clear is this does not require vaccinations as a condition of opening. So that, again, was something we had heard that might happen. That was not included in here. In fact, it's actually very explicit. It's a sentence in the bill that says it's not a requirement. So that's actually good too. This last bullet, just 1 second on this. As more and more vaccinations are available, we expect that the county definition of when a county goes to red is going to move up from 7 cases per 100,000 to 10 cases. Again, we're playing this out again because what this does is it could fast forward how fast your county gets into red, which then expands the requirements on what you have to do under the $2 billion program, the reopening and in-person instruction. So just really pay attention to where your county is. Great, next slide. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dennis. The collective bargaining sign, I'm sorry. Let me take, is that next, Troy?
Yes, so we're segueing into collective bargaining. Just one point as a communications piece of advice that the public, many members of the public heard about AB 86. They think that because it's a state law that collective bargaining at the local level is set aside and is no longer in play. Of course, you who are governance team members know that's not the case, but this may be something that you want to stress to your stakeholders so they understand any potential hurdles that remain to reopening. Keith?
Thank you, Troy. Next slide, please. So this is really not telling you guys something you already don't know. There have been 10 since March. We've had 10 guidances from the California Department of Public Health where there's emergency mitigation measures for school that also double as conditions of employment. So there has been a level of bargaining unknown and unseen before by those of you that have experienced and giving authority to your bargaining teams at the table since last March. AB 86, as you can tell by the subjects that are listed here, did touch on the mandatory subjects of bargaining that's in the Education Employment Relations Act, ERA, that we all know. And as Troy just mentioned, there has been no effort by either the legislature or the governor to suspend it temporarily during this time of a pandemic so that decisions can be made. The CDPH has said, hey, let's just all consult over these mitigation measures, but really when that gets then layered on to our bargaining framework that we are familiar with school districts and county offices, that we have been spending a lot of time. So that was the purpose really of this slide, was to kind of go into some of the detail. I mean, for example, with our work year, day and hours, you know that when we talk about extending the either by intersessions or summer schools, when we talk about work schedules and prep time, when we talk about training, like there's training required in this bill, we know that kicks into our professional development clauses. And we've been doing safety conditions of employment, which is an express condition in ERA to be negotiated, the decision of which has to be negotiated. That's not even including all the effects that have to be negotiated with these mandatory subjects. So The bill initially had some ratification language in it that the safety plan had to be ratified by in order to submit it for to get the bonus dollars. Well, that was taken out, but clearly what remains is this underlying obligation to negotiate with our employees. So that's that, and I think, Troy, you take it from here.
Next slide, please. So one other mistaken impression that exists in various communities is that the money for AB 86 is all new money that just fell from the heavens and was showered upon our local public schools. In fact, much of the revenue that's funding this program is money that was owed schools anyway, and the state has delayed payment on those debts to schools. So it's important as we deal with the ongoing funding issues in California public schools that people understand where the money is coming from, and this is not just some largesse that schools have. This is largely from money that was owed to schools anyway. Next slide, please. And now that we've concluded our rundown, our breakdown of all the details of the bill, we're going to talk about the impact of AB 86 at a local level, look at the work that some LEAs have been doing since March 2020 and over the past 12 months to get kids back in the classroom and to deal with all the pressures and challenges created by this pandemic. You've heard already from CSBA staff. From our local schools, we have with us Lori Fong, who is president of school board. We also have Linda Lunn, who is also a board president in Murrieta Valley USD. Our third board president is Kathy Thompson from the Central Elementary School District. And we also have with us Dr. Sam Buenhuestro, superintendent in Corona Norco USD, and Jeff Harris, who is a superintendent in Del Norte. I'd like to turn it over to each of you. If you could just describe a little bit about your school district and where it's located, your demographics, and then talk about the work you've been doing over the past 12 months, starting with the school board members in alphabetical order. We'll go with Lori first.
Hey, thank you. So Santa Rosa City Schools is just an hour north of San Francisco. We have about 15,500 kids. We are actually two districts put together. So we are actually K-12, K-6, and then 7-12. We just finished our certificate MOU. We already had the classified done, and the certificate MOU was fraught, but we came to a great place. And coincidentally, we're going to start April 1st, just as Governor Newsom said. So that was like, I don't know, somebody was, could tell the future.
Okay, Linda, you're next.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me today. Way back March 13th of last year, we really started with a goal in mind, and that was always, how do we get to yes for students, staff, families, and to some extent our community partners that would be affected by reopening. With this attitude, we have been working on reopening the entire time. We've been working on plans for how to even get kids back into school since last summer. We started opening cohorts in August of last fall and opening up to training and conditioning for athletes. I'm so glad the presenters, thank you for mentioning that this is not really some great big windfall. And it's not that we're ungrateful, we're going to cash that check, but it's money that was already owed to us. So we had already had an existing plan to get open. We're going to have K through 5, actually TK through 5 starting next week, grades 6 and 9 on March 23rd, and everybody else April 5th after spring break. That's of course based on the metrics, and if we fall into that red tier, which we believe is going to happen. We've had great union support. We have a terrific relationship with both of our unions, and they have been in lockstep with us since last March. Again, getting to that yes for students. How can we open? How can we get students back? They've worked with us, and we've definitely had bumps in the road where we had to really put our heads down and work, but we've enjoyed great support from them. Right now, we're just waiting for the authorizations for the metrics of the county to allow us to go further in opening. Some of the things that we're looking to fund with this, of course, is learning acceleration and recovery and the social emotional supports that are going to emerge. We don't know what all those are yet, but we're ready for them and we're ready to spend money on them to help. Would have been nice if this wasn't all in one big chunk. Would have been nice if this could have been spread out over a few years, because we know that the learning recovery and some of the social emotional stuff is not going to be solved in 1 year. We're going to see this for a few years and we're going to be dealing with this. That ongoing money would have been nice. The things that we're kind of focusing on as well, our transportation costs are probably going to go up quite a bit if we are not just picking kids up at 2:30 and dropping them off, or picking them up, sorry, at 8:30 in the morning and dropping them off at 2:30. We're doing 2 cohorts a day for K through 5. And so that's going to double our elementary school transportation costs. As well, we're very, very cognizant that our activities, athletics, the arts, those are all events that signal hope and optimism. And we want to fully support those for the next few weeks as we can, because many of those activities are funded by parents, fundraising and ticket sales and events. And of course, with no spectators at sports, we're not going to have that kind of funding coming in. So that's where we're going to focus putting some of that funding.
Great, thank you, Linda. It seems like you put in a tremendous amount of work, and I know that's representative of what's happened across the state. Kathy, let's go to you next.
Hi, I am the board president of a school district of about 4,200 kids. We're about 30 miles east of Los Angeles in Rancho Cucamonga, and the unique challenges we face are that there are 5 small school districts, elementary districts, that all feed into a high school district, and so each of us have our own set of interesting challenges, struggles, and successes, and different pushes from parent groups and the community as well. So we have been, as our superintendent has put it, ready to pivot at any moment ever since the March 13th date. And so it has been an ongoing situation where we look at the current, what's going on, and how can we get kids back safely? How can we get technology to kids? How can we, it's just been a hurdle after a hurdle after a hurdle that has been overcome. Our teachers have been very, very supportive. Our community has been very supportive, but it's been a lot. There was certainly hope we could come back at the fall of the year, and when that didn't happen, again, pivoting to a form of instruction that would best support our students. Our primary goal is to keep our eyes on what's going to keep our students and staff healthy, being able to offer immunizations to our staff. Before returning, we had a plan in place that we were getting ready to implement, and of course, this bill kind of changed that, and we modified so that we can take as many dollars as we can get to be as successful as we can possibly be with the few weeks that are left in school.
Thanks, Kathy. We'll now turn it over to the superintendents. Dr. Buenrostro, if you would go first.
Thank you, Troy. So Corona Norco Unified School District is it's in western Riverside County, 30 minutes from Disneyland. That's the way we like to describe it. It would be east of Disneyland. So 3 cities comprise Corona Norco. We have the city of Corona, Norco, and Eastvale. Roughly 53,000 students. We fluctuate, but we tend to be like around the 8th largest in the state of California. Very diverse community, over 50 languages. Our socioeconomic numbers, or ethnicities, I should say, excuse me. We have 53% Latino, Hispanic, 23% white, roughly about 13% Asian and Pacific Islander, and about 6% African American, and then a variety of others. But we have pockets of poverty. We call them our circle, our older parts of town. And we also have the foothills, I call them gated communities, right? So we have a little bit of everything, and that provides a dynamic community, but also in the COVID era, it provides, you know, 2 different worlds, right? So definitely, like many other communities across the state, the bringing kids back on campus has been controversial. We've done various surveys. Roughly 2/3 of our parents want our kids back in school. And of the 53,000, we currently have 12,000 that are still doing distance learning, which is about 22%, and the other 78% are doing the remote in person. We did start last week, March 1st, with 31 of our elementary schools. Fantastic start. Kudos to our administrators and teachers that were all present and ready to go. Obviously, kudos to our parents as well and our students. So with that, our secondaries, we're just shy of the 7 case rate that has been mentioned here. So just a point away. So we anticipate that if not next week, the 15th, on the 22nd of March, we are going to start our 7 through 12 in person as well. Now, we do have some challenges with bringing, we're not able to bring all students like many other districts. So we do have high class sizes. So as a result, for example, our elementary, we're running an AM PM. So we have roughly about 16 of our children, 15, 16 show up in the morning. The other half of the class comes in the PM, 2.5 hours. Of course, our parents would like more time, but for now, it's a great start. I'll go ahead and stop there, and because I know you have other questions. Thanks.
There's so much to cover. I'm sure all of you could go on, so thank you for respecting our time constraints. Jeff Harris, please tell us about your experience.
Thanks, Troy, and thanks for the opportunity to join in today. You know, it was exactly a year ago today that I was sitting in Governor Newsom's office. The ship was offshore, and we were told schools aren't going to close, don't worry about it. And by Friday, I know we were all calling emergency meetings, and we were closing schools. Mm-hmm. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Del Norte County, and that is how we say it up here, that's how we know visitors, because they call it Del Norte, and it's actually Del Norte. We are the furthest northwest county in California. We serve roughly 4,000 students with 4 American Indian tribal governments who are partners with us, along with a Hmong Cultural Center. We're a pretty diverse community, very socioeconomically depressed, and our students have extremely high percentages of ACEs, trauma, a variety of different hurdles and obstacles to overcome in their private lives. But our board was absolutely phenomenal when we did close school in that first emergency meeting on March 15th, 2020. And they said, okay, so we're closing school now. What's this going to look like in August? And that was within a 48-hour period we were having that conversation. A couple months later, the Roadmap to Resilience came out, and we actually put together a plan for reopening all of our schools based on the stages within the Roadmap to Resilience. And that's really what we followed going into the fall. So as we kind of pushed forward, our labor partners were absolutely phenomenal. Our district office and our county office, and for those of you who don't know either, Del Norte is a single district county. So I'm both the appointed superintendent and elected county superintendent. Our district office never closed. Our board has met in person ever since March. And we really followed that moving forward with our labor partners, because they felt that it was important to continue to maintain the school, maintain function, and to get the school ready for students in the fall. When we started in August, we did have more time for professional development. We had more time to cover the safety requirements that were in both CDPH guidance and executive order at that point in time. But we were able to actually meet all those deadlines that our board had set moving forward, which was great for our community and for our students. And so we've actually been back in person in a hybrid model since October 5th. And I want to point out one really important thing. Since October 5th, we've not had one case of person-to-person spread within our schools of COVID-19. And we actually post the current COVID cases on our district website, so our families know, and we've dispelled some of that myth around the fact that COVID's running rampant through schools. I think right now we have 1 adult and 1 student within 4,000 students who are COVID positive. So, you know, we've really been able to push forward. Our high school was a little bit behind. We were planning on opening right after winter break, but then the January 14th guidance came out. It's been a surprise almost every time we turn around. So we did have to wait for our county to drop back into red, which we did the end of January, and we were able to bring our high school students back. So AB 86 really for us is about not just learning loss mitigation. Again, I think my board has been very clear. It's about learning loss mitigation and learning acceleration. And it's really about applying that multi-tiered systems of support and mindset. What are we doing for every child? What are we doing for those that are struggling in smaller groups? And then on the very tip of that pyramid, what about those that are extremely far behind, who need those explicit skills? And then how are we going to use the funding that's coming along with AB 86 to make this all come together? So that's where we are now. I will tell you there's a little bit of consternation. I think Linda said it. It's a little strange to have June deferrals, but then get this money in May. But we'll make it work. That's what schools and school boards do, and we're looking forward to what it can mean for our students.
Great, thank you for that. So a couple general questions, I'll just throw them out to the audience, and you can jump in, the panelists can jump in where they see fit. I'm curious to get your opinion, and you touched on this a little bit, but if you could just explain a little bit more, how big of a factor is AB 86 to reopening? Is that going to be a difference maker in getting more kids back in the classroom for you, or is it a nice to have, but it's not fundamental to what you're doing?
This is about 10 times the amount of money that we usually get to spend on intercession summer school. So it's going to make a huge difference, and every single kid needs it. And there's really, like Dana said, it's deep, yet it's broad, yet it's specific. So practically anything you want to do can fit in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay,
Go.
it didn't. We were already on track to be open with existing funds, and like Lori said, it's going to tremendously help over the summer and with learning acceleration. But yeah, we were already owed the money, so.
And I think for us, the critical factor in getting every student back every day really boils back down to the availability of vaccinations, and it also boils down to what our public is really struggling to understand, and that's the 4-foot minimum distancing. Our classes just aren't large enough in many cases to bring every student back with a 16 square foot bubble.
A great point, Jeff, and if I could just jump in, because a number of people in our audience asked a question related to that 4-foot distance issue. There's been a little bit of confusion about whether it's 4 feet or whether it's 6 feet. That was some of the guidance initially. So can someone talk about that?
I'll go ahead and jump in. CDC has recommended 4 feet. The California, to my understanding, and as it has been said, things are constantly changing. The California Department of Public Health is recommending 6 feet. That's what's recommended. Locally here for Riverside County, our Dr. Kaiser, he's in charge, and it is 6 feet as well. So even if we were to try to negotiate something for 4 feet, it would not be approved. So we have that challenge of, again, bringing in, we have large class sizes, so we do have the challenge of trying to bring in more students. The most we can bring in a standard classroom is about 16 students.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good description too about how the county public health officer plays a role in this, because the guidance that we got in January said 6 feet, good faith effort for 6 feet, you must show your work, but no less than 4 feet. So there have been situations, depending upon what county you're in, where the 4 feet has been permissible. So that's where the confusion lies. So 6 feet certainly, but it says no less than 4, and you must show a good faith effort where you showed you did hybrid, you went outside, whatever it might have been, that you then have had to have the 4 feet in the classrooms.
I want to put in there that it has always been our focus to get our schools open as soon as possible. And like has been said, our district office never closed. Our classified employees have always been on site. Our teachers have been teaching from schools. We've always had a plan to reopen, and we're not being driven by this money. We're driving because we want to do what's right for kids. absolutely, like Linda said, we'll cash the check, and it will definitely help us get there, but it did tweak how we're getting there, changing our initial plans in order to meet the qualifications of AB 86.
So if I can, so I want to thank all of you for those comments, and Kathy, thank you for bringing us back to Troy's question, because I think in the discussion around AB 86, that is one of the things that I think that, you know, we talked about a lot internally and externally as well, which is this fact that you all are doing the work already. You already had the plans. The money's great, but you were going to do this anyway. And so I think going back to just from a public discourse standpoint or public perception standpoint, this notion that somehow AB 86 has been the driver for you to do what you've already been doing, it's just, it just doesn't make any sense. So I think it's really important, as you all have discussed, to make that clear. You've been doing the work and you were going to do the work anyway. The money is helpful, but it wasn't the driving motivation for what you do every single day.
Exactly.
And I think we've established that the rate of community spread and lack of access to vaccinations were the biggest hurdles to reopening. But putting that to the side, what would you say were the biggest challenges that you've been working through as you try and get kids back in the classroom?
I'm going to jump in. This is an easy one. It's dealing with the unions, specifically the teachers union. You know, from the early get-go a year ago, when we closed down our schools, that same Friday we got a cease and desist letter. So that created a bad tone already, adversarial, if you will. And then you hear communication coming down from Sacramento CTA of do not open schools no matter what. And so that places an extra challenge for us. And then recently we were talking just the last question about 6 feet of distancing. Same thing. I can tell you that our even if the county was to lessen that or permit to 4 feet, it's going to be a battle with our union as far as going under 6 feet. And that's again because of them knowing that they have a lot of say so in the negotiations piece. So.
I think for us, the speed bumps were just mainly the county metrics. When we could get the authorizations, when those doors were going to open. We're focusing a little bit right now onto what our parents and students are going to need support and resource-wise for exiting the pandemic. Not everybody's comfortable coming back on campus, and how can we support kids getting back on campus whose parents may not feel great about it, or the students themselves may not feel great about it. Of course, we're going to continue to offer online learning for the virtual learning for those who want it for the rest of the year. But it will be interesting to see how we can support people. I just like that phrase, exiting the pandemic. It's hopeful.
Troy, an answer to the question.
Go ahead, Lori. Sorry.
Thanks, Kathy. Sorry about that. The biggest challenge is that in Sonoma County, where we are, there are 40 school districts, some very tiny. The smallest is 100, and we're the largest one, even mid-sized compared to some of you. But so the parents are just banding together, and you know, Marin is opening or San Francisco's opening. You know, what about you? And we're all different because we all have different. The counties have different regulations, and so having those different regulations, yet having the parents cite other counties who may have more money or different demographics puts a lot of pressure. And so Dr. Buenrostro was talking about the unions, and I want to say that it wasn't the most difficult, but you know, certainly we tried to partner. We did partner, so we're proud of that. But like I used the word before, it was fraught. And I really actually have to champion the union, because finally, if we really think, and school board members everywhere, everybody, CSBA, you know this, when the state of California doesn't prioritize kids, doesn't prioritize our students, and we are always left with juggling money, getting deferrals, this is what happens. And it's all coming down in COVID. And so I think the toughest thing is trying to preserve our focus on equity. And so who is clamoring the most to open the schools? More privileged parents. who wasn't saying anything and just trying to hang on to their internet, whatever we could, we're more marginalized populations. And so all the work that we're doing in MTSS, and everybody is, of course, is what counts for so much. But again, it's how we prioritize students. Had we done vaccine prioritization longer ago, we wouldn't have been in this really fraught MOU discussion that we just finished.
And on that note, the changing requirements coming down from the CDC and the state and does not inspire confidence either in our families, because no one, do we mask, do we not mask, going back to last March and April? Do we immunize, do we not immunize? When those things are uncertain, it breeds a society of uncertainty. And so parents are hesitant to trust what is being said either by the government or the schools as to what is really safe. And at this point, we have 30% of our students who are going to stay home and do distance learning through the end of the year because of that lack of, I'm not really sure what's the best thing to do.
Well, and if I can just kind of jump in with what Kathy was saying, I think that the changing mandates, the changing CDPH guidelines, the changing nomenclature, not having the same definition for words throughout the last 12 months has really eroded the confidence, the transparency, the ability to communicate with our labor partners, with our families, with our legislators, with the governor's office, and even internally to some cases. So what we really see is every time we're having these broader conversations, we're having to redefine the conversation and either push back old definitions and conversations and re-explain those in a new narrative, or we're having to use the old terms and then translate as we go along. And that leads to some extremely difficult conversations, which can impact both negotiations, bringing students back, how we're responding to things like another new plan, whatever that is. Those are just, I think, fundamental issues that have happened over the last few months.
Jeff and Kathy, you both touched on something really important. I was sitting down with our superintendent, Pat Kelly, a couple days ago, and he went back and counted. We've had 8 transition, pivot, things we thought we were going to do, things we couldn't do. And for staff and for students and families, that those disruptions and those having to pivot so quickly, and it's really disruptive and it's really hard, and we're getting to the end of our rope as far as being flexible. How many more flexible times do I have left in me as a parent?
And if I could just say one other thing, I think the next hurdle that we're all going to face is what is in person, what is hybrid, because we're hearing people are in person, but they mean hybrid, and we're hearing that people are, whatever it is. And so I don't remember who said it, but that's going to pit districts against one another as people point to these badly defined terms.
Mm-hmm.
So want to get to a couple more audience questions. I really love this back and forth. I wish we had a couple more hours, but I do want to respect some of the viewers who submitted questions beforehand. And a question that's come up a lot, and this is more of a Dennis and Keith question, is around the issue of liability. There's some trepidation about bringing students back to campus when there's not really enough protection for districts not knowing how to operate exactly in this uncertain circumstance and what sort of exposure that presents for them. So can you talk about why liability was not included in this bill?
Hey, Troy, before the Dennis and Keith jump in, and I want to just jump in here and say, this is a really important point that CSBA and our advocacy, we have been making consistently throughout this entire pandemic, and even leading up to and including the last few days before a deal was struck on AB 86. And to our chagrin, that the legislature did not and the governor did not include it. I think it was a really missed opportunity to address an issue that I think it's fair to say has been a priority for every district and county office during this pandemic. So I just wanted to put that out there because I know this has been a priority for us as an organization. And a lot of discussions happened, but ultimately nothing happened in the bill. But go ahead, Dennis and Keith.
Well, you know, the why it's particularly frustrating is if you were following that conversation in Washington a couple months ago about not holding businesses liable, it was almost free for all. Our language is very tight. It says, you know, there'd be a limit of liability if you were following state and local guidance. So it's not Wild West out there. We were talking about if they're following guidance, don't let them be sued. One judgment can completely throw a small or medium-sized district right into fiscal insolvency. And, you know, that's a case we've been making since last March, and the legislature and the administration have just not dealt with it. So yeah, it's completely frustrating because you've been told by your insurers, both private insurers and those of you who are in JPAs, that you're not covered, and it is really frustrating because we're talking about very specific instances. So let's let Keith talk a little bit about from the legal perspective, but politically, it's just a real missed opportunity, especially in this legislation, for the legislature to just put it into place, you know, so.
And Dennis, I would say we should at least acknowledge Assemblyman O'Donnell for, last session for making an attempt at putting language into an actual bill, even though it didn't go anywhere. I think just acknowledging that is important in this discussion and the narrative. Keith?
Yeah, just really briefly, what we've been saying really since day one, we've written about the liability issue, we've supported legislation. The key is just to do your best to follow the bouncing ball. I hear CDC being mentioned, but I've always said, no, follow CDPH. That's what we want to follow, our own health standards. The feds have been all over the maps, and they just changed the colors on us and really didn't do us much good. So follow as closely as you can. We know that we're working without a net. And there are some JPAs that are providing a modicum of protection and will defend. No umbrella companies are doing that whatsoever. So, but is it a precursor or otherwise an impediment to reopening? We say no. School boards have the deference in this, and you see even now the dollars are coming in. Clearly, now we have some local control with resources, which is we're not used to. I thought what Lori said about summer school and intercession was really emblematic of really the positive side of this bill. But going back to it, just follow guidance, do the best you can. You've got to make sure employees know what's up and what's down, and that will protect you in the event that there is any type of liability lawsuit that might be filed. They're going to have a tough time tracing. Causation's crazy. How do you know where you got it? All of that is what lawyers will tell you, but it should not be an impediment to reopen.
Thank you, Vernon, Dennis, and Keith. We also had a number of questions that related to high need students. As you've discussed, some of the funding for this bill is directed at high need students, prioritizing getting those students who've been disproportionately impacted both before COVID and by the pandemic back on campus to benefit from in-person instruction. And one particular question I thought was interesting is, if in your district, high need students are a large percentage of the population or even the majority of students, what does implementation look like? Because it's not like you're targeting a pocket of students. The high need students may be the norm in your district. And so how does that change your approach?
Well, it changed our approach in that if we were going to meet all of those areas of high need, we were going to have to bring back, it just made more sense to bring back all of our children rather than break it up by grade levels as we were initially thinking TK to 2 and then adding a grade level. Once you had that issue, it's really a descriptor of our population, much as Dr. Buenrostro said. So that definitely was a piece that did drive, a change in our planning.
If I can jump in, so from the very get-go, we went to transition to distance learning. The population or the students with IEPs was, I think, the biggest frustration because distance learning many times does not work with our students. That they need that assistant, sometimes somebody to hand them something or to hold something for them. And so I really felt for our parents. So as soon as we could back in October, again, with the guidance of our Board of Education and their leadership, we were able to start bringing back our special, again, our students with special needs, especially those ones that had some severe needs, that because, it's tough for the parents. And then of course, we brought in also our English learners, that we have a significant population, and because we know that children of poverty many times are in an apartment with 3 or 4 siblings there, and distance learning quite doesn't work. And early on, we had to get devices to those households as well. So that was a challenge, because we ordered thousands of, actually, we ended up ordering 60,000 Chromebooks, but that supply chain, as you guys know, the supply chain was delayed. So we had families that were hurting, and those are the groups that in October and November we really targeted here as a district.
Great. And then sort of on the other side of the equation, and Dennis, maybe you can shed some light on this, we had some basic aid districts which were wondering how they figure into the whole equation from a funding standpoint.
Well, yeah, since both programs, the allocation is made based on a proportional share of LCFF. If you look at Ed Code section 42238.02, that's where the definitions and the math occurs on calculating everyone's LCFF entitlement. And that's the section that's used before you apply property taxes. So basic aid districts have a proportional share. Every district and county office and charter school has a proportional share. It's just that when you're, let's say doing a boost to LCFF, property taxes might mean, okay, your basic aid, you don't play in this, but not in this money. So, just make sure that those basic aid districts that you expect, you're going to be getting this check for both of these programs, because it's before you back out property taxes. And that's our understanding. We've checked at several places. We were pleasantly surprised, because that's what we kept saying is that's why don't make this something you apply for. Just get this out the door, and then to see how it does benefit basic aid, because there are needs in basic aid districts as well. Not all basic aid districts are wealthy. I mean, some, that's what we have to keep saying up here in Sacramento. So right now, that's the understanding. Basic Aid Association knows that. We've talked to a couple of basic aid districts, and so they're all running their math right now to make sure that they, when that money comes, that it's the right amount. So far, so good.
Thanks, Dennis. We've had a number of questions about middle school. First, there seems to be some confusion about how when you move into the red tier, you have to not only bring elementary students back for in-person instruction, but at least one of the grades from the secondary level. So Dennis, first, if you could explain how that works, and then if our panelists in local districts that have had middle school and high school students come back could talk about what that experience has been like specific to the older kids.
Well, and Troy, you explained it really well, because that's basically what it says. When you get to the red tier, and note that red tier could be reached faster with the new requirements, but it's just as you said, the requirement is K through 6 and at least one grade level 7 to 12. I mean, at our level, at the policy level, that's the explanation. So I'm just as hungry to hear from the people in the field, the superintendents and the board members, what it means to them. But that's basically it. Could you go K-12? Absolutely. What the legislation is saying, at least bring back one of the higher grade levels. And there's some difference in interpretation, because there's local differences on what is middle and high school based on, are you an elementary district, a unified, that kind of stuff. So there is some of the language trying to design around that to allow that difference in interpretation, but clearly it's an intent to try to get at least in person to some levels of high school, if you're not already doing that. So, what's funny, because what we read here in Sacramento, trying to interpret it, I really am trying to figure out too what you all in the school board land and superintendent land hear when you hear that.
We chose to bring 6th grade and 9th grade back first, and that's 6th grade is the first year of middle school. And we chose to do that because here are these kids who, like 5th graders, who are in one classroom, one teacher, and now they've been virtual all year. they don't know how to get around campus. They don't, going to 6 different classes a day is not something that they're skilled at just yet. So we're going to bring them back for a whole week. And that also, that gradual bringing people back in steps is building capacity among our teachers and our staff at the sites to be able to come back in hybrid. And again, we talk about what are our strategies for exiting the pandemic, and this is one of them, bringing back 6th and 9th grade.
We also received a couple questions about what does happen, God forbid, there are cases, and how the process works to respond to that and potentially close the school if that's required, or take other mitigation steps to deal with COVID.
Well, so we've been through this a couple of times, and really it relies on a lot of footwork, I think, from districts, right? Because there is contact tracing that has to be done at the district office level. There are certain requirements under the CDPH Cal OSHA guidelines that we have to be following. We have to go along with our bargained MOUs as far as who we notify and when. And then there's also the partnership with local public health. So a lot of moving parts and pieces. Mostly what we've done, because we have been a day in person and then a day distance, a day in person and a day distance, so we've been running cohorts, is identifying whether or not a cohort needs to close. And if a cohort does close, or actually at this point it's stable groups, that goes back to the definition thing I talked about earlier. Anyway, if a stable group needs to close, the teacher may also be quarantined during that time, in which case now we're bringing in a substitute for the duration of the quarantine. We have not had any outbreaks, so we haven't had to deal with that, or with full school or district closure because of outbreak. But it really, really does play into the relationship that you have with county public health, because I'm sure that Sam has a very different relationship than we do because of the size of his district and the size of my county. So, it really, I would say, lean on the folks that are doing that contact tracing and take a look at what the law says.
I mean, the bill does allow for, if you're open and if there's an outbreak and you need to shut down a classroom, the bill does allow for that in both programs. And so the penalties aren't so strict that you close one classroom down, you're going to lose 15 ADA. It's not that specific. So pay attention to that, because really, health and safety of employees and students and families is a priority, and it's written in there. And to not penalize you for making sure that you're keeping, your students and your staff safe. So just read it. I think once you see that in there, you'll feel a lot better about how the penalties and the forfeitures are if you're not doing reopening, or if you're not serving these cohorts of kids. That's where the penalties come in, not if you've got an outbreak.
Right.
Hey, Troy, I need to just take a minute and say something, and it's kind of not on this topic. Sorry, I can't believe I'm going to say that. Thank you to the superintendents, and thank you to CSBA staff. My superintendent is gifted, Diane Kitamura, and she's doing the details. She knows all the stuff, so the superintendents do. Board members, as I pull myself out of the weeds, we're policy. And so we need to continue to take this opportunity for the pivot that we've done and the kind of learning that our teachers have done in terms of tech tools and how we reach all the different kids, because we have to use what we've learned and continue with this new learning, because if we go back to the status quo, we're going to continue to fail some kids or fail too many kids. I've got 20% of our seniors who needed a different graduation plan to get them to graduation. And they didn't just fail during COVID. They've been failing since, 4th grade, 5th grade, trauma, whatever, we all know that. And so as school board members on policy, we should be looking at grading. We should look at, where kids go to school actually. COVID has really freed us up in a way. So I want us to really look at policy. What are we doing with what we have in our system, that industrial model, agrarian model that we need to change and use this, because our teachers, it's open, it's wide open now, and we're policy setters, and we have to keep asking for this.
Thanks for that, Lori. A couple questions also about special education. Just want to dive a little bit more deeply into how we are serving special needs students as we reintegrate them into the classroom, particularly those who have more severe disabilities, where it may be challenging within the context of some of the safety precautions around distancing and so forth to educate in the normal fashion. If we could get some perspective on that.
Sure, I'll jump in a little bit. Earlier, I said that the biggest challenge was working with our association, but that's while that's true, it's also been a partnership, right? And so that's very important. So we have we learned the first few months that we were in the pandemic. So we've been working quite collaboratively the last five months or so. And so one of the things that we did is work closely with them to develop a special MOU to bring back all of our special education students with severe needs. So with that, obviously safety was number one, and so we have written some MOUs with them, and making sure we follow the California Public Health guidelines under the small cohorts. So we've been able to bring them back successfully, and we do know that some of the IEPs. Parents and advocates and attorneys are going to want to get some comp ed for some of the education that's been missed. So those are conversations and that we are having through the IEP process.
This is a legislative question. Oh, sorry, Linda, were you going to jump in? Or?
Well, I was just going to say I really appreciate your comments, and I go back to an old quote: "Never let a good crisis go to waste." There are so many good things that could come out of this. I know that here in Marietta, we're actually developing a completely separate school, and it's going to be a K-8 homeschool option. We've hired a principal, and they're developing it now for opening in August, which is something we haven't had before, because there is sort of a subgroup of kids. I have 2 children enrolled in Marietta Valley School District. One of them is going to be great back in hybrid, and one wants to stay virtual, and she is happy as a clam and really being successful in virtual. And recognizing that there are students that can be needs that can be met that way, and just really opening our minds and our, as you said, policies to how we can best meet children where they are on an individual basis. So important after this. And I hope we don't go back to normal. I hope we go back to better.
Yes, that's something that Linda Darling Hammond, president of the State Board of Education, has expressed repeatedly in state board meetings, that we need to be creative in how we address this moment. It's a chance for a reset, or at least to re-examine some of our practices. And I think our districts have been doing that, have been very resourceful in the way you've been serving students during the pandemic. Another question is on a legislative point, which is, are there going to be any trailer bills or any sort of cleanup bills that are going to address some of the issues in AB 86? Dennis, have you heard any rumors about that?
Not yet. You know, the bill was just signed Friday. I think as we progress in a few weeks, you know, the trailer bills are parked. They're in each other's houses. Those are kind of intended for the big budget conversation, which is, you know, waiting for the May revision and stuff. So there might be some tweaks, but I haven't heard anything yet. So just watch. You know, we've got AXA members and CSBA members here. Just watch our publications and stuff to see. But right now, I think everyone's just trying to figure out how to, you know, get your students and your staff back. And as I'm talking, I just got texted, and I'm going to bet it's from my staff who's listening. And we are. Okay, people are talking about whether or not there's going to need. So the same question is being discussed amongst the advocates. So if you see tweaks or something, get them to us, get them to the AXA staff as well, to see if we can get something done pretty quickly. But right now, it's like the ink is barely dry on the bill, you know.
Understandable. Another question that's a little bit forward-looking is, how will AB 86 impact the budget? I think the unspoken fear there is because the perception is that schools are getting money now to deal with the pandemic. There'll be less on the back end in the regular budget for the upcoming 21-22 school year. Is there any connection there, or how does that affect things?
Well, if you recall the January budget, it included some big ticket items like cost of living increase for LCFF, a 2-year cost of living increase. There was about $1 billion in kind of one-off special programs, one-time money on professional development, teacher pipeline, things like that. There is enough in Prop 98 and, from last year's money, this year's money that's going to these two bills. There's also enough going into the next year to take care of all of those issues. The governor also identified money in a TikTok. I don't know, you call on Twitter the tweets. I don't know what you call TikTok postings. He said in February there's another $10 billion in revenue. That has not been included in these two bills, so that is still out there. So all of the stuff that was, all the proposals in the January budget are still out there. Nothing's being pulled back. And we're still pressing, from CSBA's perspective, for the state to pay off the June deferral. There's enough cash to be able to do that. We're also talking about expanding cost of living increases to other programs, including transportation, career tech, adult ed, those kinds of things. So outside of these two bills passing, it's more of a normal budget year from this point through June 30 as the budget negotiations come together. So even tracking cash flow at the Department of Finance, everything seems to be tracking like we had heard in the January budget. So, stay tuned, but it seems like now things are kind of settled in back to normal. They're going to start talking about regular legislation and kind of letting the normal budget process happen as well. So we've got our priorities that are kind of sounding normal. COLA, it's nice to be talking about COLA,
The other thing I would add, Troy, is that I do think it is important to watch some of the non-budgetary proposals, meaning non-budget proposals that are part of the budget, but the regular bills that could have a fiscal impact. Particularly, I think some of the labor proposals that are out there that I think would impact the cost for districts and county offices in a significant way long term. So while it may not necessarily be in the budget, quote unquote, in the budget, there are other things out there that, the state giveth in one hand and they take it away with the other hand. I think we've got to be diligent and watch these non-budget bills as well, because several of them that have been introduced right now, I think, have some financial impact that folks really need to focus in on.
Good point.
Well, there's wisdom in that statement, because even outside of those kinds of bills, there's proposals to expand TK to the rest of 4-year-olds, and that's an expensive proposal that the proponents are saying, hey, while Prop 98 is growing, let's do this. So there are some very high dollar proposals out there, as well as kind of nit and nat mandates, because there is this assumption that there's this windfall and that kind of stuff, when really this is just turning out to be a normal Prop 98 budget year. There is no windfall. It's just that the reduction that was expected didn't occur. So that's kind of why it's just kind of a normal budget year now.
Good points, and we'll certainly have a legislative webinar that will explore the major proposals that are going to impact public schools in the not too distant future. But want to wrap up with one question for the panel, touching on these themes of being forward-looking and being creative about educating students. Relates to the extended learning provisions. I'm just interested to hear what new approaches are you going to take to summer school, to the structure of the school day or the school year, to tutoring. What interventions are going to be in place to try and help mitigate learning loss or students that have suffered socially and emotionally over the next year to 2 to 3 years?
I think it's important that we look at not just, like you said, the learning loss, but also the social emotional pieces. And so I know that we're looking at dedicating funds towards building those kinds of skills back into our students. Linda touched on our kids who are just entering middle school, or hers just entering high school, helping to spend some extra monies to get them acclimated to that huge change in life that has basically been put on hold for a year. And of course, we're looking at creative solutions of what can we do over the summer and with some extra money, even to send things home that will help our students who may not be able to come in during those summer hours.
We're looking to greatly expand our summer offerings. Typically, we provide a lot of credit recovery and bridge programs into the high school, but to really expand those opportunities for students, not only from an academic perspective, but again from the social emotional. We've all been, cooped up in our houses, and getting kids back to being with each other. I'm hoping for, I'm just hoping for this, that there might even be some AP opportunities at the high school level over the summer. If we can pull that together, that would be great.
And I think we're looking at the same thing. We'll probably have, we're looking something that we're calling a seamless summer opportunity, right? So our youngest to our oldest students can engage in a variety of things. We don't want to call it summer school because we want it to be fun, exciting, engaging with kids, but also expanding CTE opportunities, expanding our high school kids' opportunities to go into the workforce and kind of get some of those experiences that they haven't been able to get so far, and really prepping our staff for when we come back, because again, under that MTSS, that multi-tiered systems of support framework, we're looking at behavioral, social, emotional, and academic. So how do we do the learning loss mitigation at all three tiers across the board, with students walking back in the door in August? It's a daunting thing to do, but it's the right thing for us all to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to also expand with what my colleagues here have said. The MTSS has been a critical piece, and right now with what has been said here, I think with the 10% allocation there for support staff or paraeducators, wonderful opportunity with MTSS, because that's a piece that's been missing there. So provide more supports for our students, Saturday academies, whatever it takes. Linda had mentioned AP, absolutely, AP exams, and because those children have needs as well. And so those interventions are coming up as well, because the testing is in May. So we will do everything, including what has been said again, expanding summer school. I love the term that our coaches used last week. Right now, it's time to adapt. And now with the money that's coming, it's time to innovate and then overcome. And that's what we will do.
I like that.
I think that's a perfect note to end it on. That is really the spirit of public schools: innovating, overcome, doing more with less. So thank you to all our panelists for all you've done to support students, staff, and families during the 12 months, and all you will continue to do. For those who haven't been able to see the whole event, we will post a recording of this as well as a PowerPoint deck to the website before the close of day tomorrow. We know we had some video difficulties early on in the proceedings, so we'll re-record that part so you'll have a seamless experience when you do watch the video. If we weren't able to get to your questions, please email us at csba@csba.org, or you can go to our COVID-19 website. Just type in CSBA and COVID-19 or coronavirus. There's a portal there you can use to submit questions, and we will get back to you quickly with responses. Thanks everyone for joining in. Take care and good luck.
Bye.